This Sunday on Capital Connection, U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth joins us. Democrats push to show their sensitivity to the rising cost of living in this election year. Plus, roadblocks frustrate the access to affordable health care in the central Illinois area, but could pop up across the state. How lawmakers are tackling that issue in Springfield. House Republican Sandy Hamilton joins us, and our Reporters Roundtable makes a comeback. Dave Dahl from WTAX and Brendan Moore from the Decatur Herald and Review analyze the politics and strategy behind Democrats running ads in the Republican primary. It's all coming up on Capital Connection.
From the Illinois State Capitol Rotunda, Capitol Bureau Chief Mark Maxwell is asking the tough questions. This is Capital Connection.
Welcome to Capital Connection. I'm Mark Maxwell reporting from the Illinois State House on this Sunday, April 3rd. The Illinois House and Senate enter the final stretch as they sprint toward an April 8 deadline on Friday to pass a budget to Governor Pritzker's desk and tackle many of the remaining controversial issues. Can they get a crime bill done in that amount of time? It probably is unlikely at this point in an election year, but they're tackling many of those big important issues in Springfield. So while they sort those last things out, we turn our attention for now to the U.S. Capitol, where Senator Tammy Duckworth is pushing a popular proposal to cap the cost of insulin nationwide. Senator, I noticed this bill from Senator Warnock in Georgia still has 18 Senate Democrats and 50 all of the Senate Republicans who have not yet signed on to the plan. Do you feel any urgency that the political mood here now, do you feel that maybe Senate Democrats might slip into the minority next year if they don't take the urgent moment of now to do something about this to make health care more affordable?
Well, what I'm concerned with are the people who spend on average $6,000 annually on insulin alone. That's why we need to pass this as soon as possible, because there are families right now that are rationing insulin. I even heard stories of young children, knowing how much insulin costs, rationing their own insulin because they were afraid it was costing their parents so much money. I'm less worried about senators than I am about families and people who rely on these medications for survival. And so that's the urgency that I feel, is to try to pass this as soon as possible.
But the power to do something can be fleeting in a political world. Do you commit to try and get this done before the November election?
Yes, absolutely. I'd like to try to get it done in the next couple of months. The goal is to get help to people as soon as possible. So it is an urgent matter, especially if you are diabetic and are reliant on insulin to survive.
We've seen that drug manufacturers, drug makers in the U.S. make a lot more here than they do in other countries. Their profit margin is just higher. Where is the insurance industry in all this?
Well, the way I see this is that insurance should be covering some of these drugs. And yes, this is a combination of the insurance industry. It's a combination of the drug manufacturers as well. Insulin is a good example of a drug that's been around for over 100 years. It's not a drug that, a pharmaceutical has spent $200 million to develop and now needs to recover some of their costs. This is just a low-cost drug to produce that is a high profit margin because they can jack up the price as much as possible. And what this bill would do is that it would require private groups or individual insurance plans to cover the insulin dosage and cap it at $35 a month. And they can do that because they certainly provide it at a cheaper price overseas.
If you'll allow a cultural reference, Gordon Gekko taught us that greed is good. Maybe that sounds cool on Wall Street or in some executive suite boardroom somewhere, but I think that line might sound a little more callous, a little different when mom or dad are on a deathbed. When it comes to healthcare, what is the proper balance between capitalism and price controls?
Well, I think there's this idea of excessive profits, right? Certainly, some drugs that took a lot of investments to develop, and if they're still under their original patent, I don't begrudge companies for recovering their investments. That's perfectly reasonable. Many of our pharmaceuticals have a program where they help provide the drugs, especially if it's a life-saving drug, to patients for for beneficial use for those who can't afford it. But, I draw the line, whether it's insulin or I went through this with epinephrine injectors, where the company that makes epinephrine injectors bought out all of the generic manufacturers and then jacked up the price from, $100 a pen to $600 for 2 pens at a time. There is excessive profit for something that's been around a long time, and that's simply not acceptable. That's why it's so important to pass this legislation capping the price of insulin at $35. I mean, my heart broke when I heard about the little boy who's, I think, was 11, who was not giving himself the insulin that he needed because he knew how expensive it was, and he overheard his parents talking about how expensive it was and whether or not they could afford it. A child should not be put in that situation. And one of the things that we can do to help is to cap the cost of insulin at $35 a month.
We actually met with a family like that just recently, a local union electrician who 20 years ago had to quit his job at a non-union shop because his insurance benefits back then just couldn't cover the $800 a month for his little girl's insulin back then. He got the gold-plated union healthcare benefits, and for 20 years he's worked at this new shop. Then cancer came. But he ran into another pursuit of profit in the healthcare industry that has created an active roadblock for him now in getting to his radiation oncologist at Springfield Clinic. That's the fight between Springfield Clinic and Blue Cross Blue Shield. It's creating a real roadblock between tens of thousands of patients in our area who have to overcome that cost hurdle, or who have to navigate a dead-end directory or a ghost network of doctors who may or may not actually be on the other side of that door to get health care. How concerned or how involved are you in this issue right now, in this roadblock to affordable access to health care?
I'm very, very concerned, and this is something very common. In this case with the state of Illinois, I'm so glad to see the Pritzker administration holding Blue Cross Blue Shield accountable. But this is a bigger issue than just what's happening in Springfield with Blue Cross taking those clinics out of network without telling anybody about it. What happened to me was when I had my daughter, I had to have an emergency cesarean, and I went to a hospital that I knew was in network. And I was on Blue Cross Blue Shield at the time, and I went to a hospital that was in network. I'm having my cesarean. A doctor scrubs in that I never met before, nobody asked me if he could scrub in. Turns out he was not in network, and I was hit with a $30,000 bill for this doctor scrubbing into my emergency cesarean that I knew nothing about. That's called surprise billing, and that needs to end as well. That happens all the time. A patient will go and will look, oh, here we go. This hospital is in network because it says it's in network. But when you actually go in and you look further, it turns out there's one doctor in the whole hospital that's in network, and they're claiming that the whole hospital is in network. That's not acceptable. Then the patient gets hit with a $10,000, $50,000, $100,000 bill for out-of-network care. That's not acceptable.
Federal law actually could require insurance companies to cover many of those instances. In fact, there are some surprise billing regulations in federal law even now. But federal tax code, a separate issue, also allows major advantages to not-for-profit insurance companies to act as a mutual reserve if they act in the interest of their members. That's the agreement in the tax code. But its members are patients who need doctors. They're not just paying customers. They need that network of insurance that they bought into. So if an insurance company is using its leverage in the marketplace to gobble up sometimes 70 or 80% of an entire state's population, to drive doctors' wages lower, to drive doctors out of the rural stretches of Illinois and their family practices in some instances, then why should that insurance company enjoy that kind of a special federal tax benefit?
I agree with you. That's why I'm participating in several initiatives here to help make sure that surprise billing or those types of practices are eliminated. And we're going to do everything that we can. I'm pleased that the state of Illinois is doing work in this as well. I also support adjusting our insurance program so that there is, for example, Medicare buy-in. I think that if you are 50 years old or older, you should be able to buy into Medicare with the Affordable Care Act. I think there could be a public option on the exchange so that people can choose to buy into some a version of healthcare that is not necessarily at the mercy of the insurance companies. But we can and should do better. We're the wealthiest nation on the face of the earth, the most developed, and yet we don't have healthcare that all Americans can afford. And that's shameful because medical debt is crippling to the American people.
And that crippling medical debt Right now, a lot of patients who are feeling the weight of it are trying to go to the U.S. Department of Labor to get an answer for it. They feel their continuity of care was not provided to them under an ERISA plan, a federally regulated plan. They have to go to the feds, not the state. Are you confident that the U.S. Department of Labor is doing enough right now to help these patients find comfort and relief from these astronomical $50,000 medical bills that arrive on their doorstep during cancer? If not, what should the Department of Labor do today to respond to those needs?
Well, you know what? I think that the Department of Labor is dealing with it. I don't have the latest information. I also know that there are some pieces of legislation within the HELP committee, which is the Health Education Labor Committee, that is dealing with this issue. That I am also looking at joining to try to make sure we solve the problem again, so that the average consumer, if you need help, you should be able to go to the doctor. You should be able to afford it. You should be able to afford your health insurance, and it should not be something that basically cripples an entire family's financial well-being.
I want to pivot to foreign policy. A lot of people watching Russia's war on Ukraine. You've called on President Biden to sell tanks to the NATO member Poland. Should he also supply planes and tanks to Ukraine directly?
Well, the issue with the tanks that we have and the planes that we have is that the Ukrainian military is not trained in our aircraft. So it would not be appropriate technology to send to Ukraine, because the Ukrainian forces, for example, can't take a year off to go learn to fly an F-22 or an F-35. But what we should be providing them with are the things that they need to counter the Russian offensive, and that is more Javelin, more Javelin missiles, more Stinger missiles. They also need Soviet era equipment that we are pulling from other NATO allies that have it, like the S-300 series of rockets, SA-10s, SA-12s. We need to provide them with many more rounds of ammunition, which we are already doing. And also we need to make sure they have some of the very basic stuff like helmets and body armor. All of this is being sent through into Ukraine right now. It's going into Poland, and from there, I get briefed multiple times a week on how the equipment is getting into Ukraine. They're getting what they need. We have more on the way. And yes, we do need to backfill our NATO allies with new equipment in exchange for the equipment that they're pushing into Ukraine. And that's where my request for the Biden administration to expedite the delivery of the M1A2 Abrams tanks to Poland, because the purchase was already in process. I just am asking that we get them there sooner.
I'm afraid we're running out of time. This will be my last question. Have you seen enough evidence that would support the Department of Justice opening a criminal investigation into former President Trump, his chief of staff Mark Meadows, into those missing phone call logs, or perhaps the text messages between Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas's wife and Mark Meadows? How serious do you take those text messages, and do you fear they undermine his impartiality on the bench?
Oh, I'm very much concerned. I'm deeply concerned that Justice Thomas can no longer be impartial, and he should be recusing himself from the cases that come before him that deal with January 6th. As for the missing tapes, that's a violation of federal law. If anybody is involved in either destroying call logs or records, they should be held accountable. That's a violation of the Presidential Records Act. And frankly, not just the former president, but anybody who is involved in helping to hide or destroy what are public records that belong to the American people should be held accountable for their actions on that day.
All right, Senator Tammy Duckworth, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
When we come back, House Republican Sandy Hamilton chimes in on that battle for affordable access to health care for patients with Blue Cross Blue Shield. That's next.